The rain on Obsidian Spire was not water. It was a corrosive, oily discharge from the atmospheric scrubbers that tasted of sulfur and forgotten industrial sins. It drummed against the reinforced plexiglass of the bar known as the Rust Bucket with a persistent, rhythmic violence. Inside, the air was a thick soup of recycled oxygen, cheap synthetic tobacco, and the ozone tang of leaking capacitors. Kaelen Vane stared into his glass of amber liquid. It was a vintage that localized traders called liquid regret, and it burned with a chemical intensity that helped numb the ghosts in his head. His hands, scarred by years of handling biohazardous materials in the trenches of the Orion Belt, were steady, though his mind was anything but. It had been 312 days since he had last seen another human. On Gorvex, humans were oddities, relics of a failed expansionist era, tolerated only because they were hardy enough to do the work the xylothane found beneath their dignity. Kaelen's leather coat, cracked and peeling, smelled of wet metal. He had stopped looking in mirrors 5 months ago. He didn't need a reflection to tell him he looked like a man who was already deceased, just waiting for his heart to get the memo. Sector Sitrep. Compromise, he muttered to himself, a habit from his days as a combat medic. He scanned the room instinctively. 2 drifters in the corner, a scrapper trying to fix a faulty Cortex patch, and the bartender, a 4-armed entity with skin the texture of sandpaper. Then the door hissed open, letting in a gust of the acidic rain and a flash of neon green. A small figure climbed onto the stool across from him. She was tiny, even for a child, but she moved with a calculated precision that lacked the flailing energy of youth. Her skin was a vibrant, translucent emerald, the hallmark of the xylothane highborn, and her eyes were twin orbs of liquid gold that seemed to record rather than see. Biological status, male. Species, human. Age, approximately 40 standard years. Estimated blood alcohol content, 0.08% and climbing, the girl said. Her voice was like a chime hitting crystal, beautiful but utterly devoid of warmth. Kaelen didn't look up. Beat it, kid. I'm off the clock, permanently. I am not a kid in the sense you imply, the girl replied, folding her 3-fingered hands on the sticky countertop. I am Nera of the House Thalassian. My chronological age is 9, but my cognitive development is currently indexed at 94th percentile for a mature xylothane academic. And I am not here for medical advice. I am here to hire a father. Kaelen finally lifted his gaze. Up close, the girl looked fragile. The faint, glowing veins beneath her emerald skin were flickering, a sign of loom wilt, the degenerative genetic decay that had been decimating the xylothane aristocracy. A father, Kaelen repeated, his voice raspy. Is this a street scam? Because I've got 0 credits and even less patience. This is not a street hustle, Scrapper, Nyra said, her gold eyes narrowing. I have analyzed the Imperial Code. To board the Sovereign Nebula and access the Ethel Core for genetic restoration, a minor must be accompanied by a complete biological or legal unit, a mother and a father. My mother is present, but my father was terminated during the political restructuring of our house. Terminated, Kaelen grunted. You mean murdered. Terminology is irrelevant. The outcome is a missing variable in my family equation, she said, leaning forward. You are human. Your DNA is not in the Imperial Registry. With a temporary biosignature spoofing, you could pass as a registered consort. 10 minutes. That is all I need. 10 minutes of pretending to care about my welfare as we pass the boarding gate. Kaelen took a long pull of his drink. You're crazy. They'll sniff out a human in a heartbeat. Your high and mighty kin can smell primal, DNA from a kilometer away. Not if you are wearing a biosync collar. A new voice cut through the grime of the bar. Kaelen looked toward the door. A woman stood there, draped in a tattered cloak that couldn't hide the regal posture of a fallen queen. Her skin was a darker shade of green than the girl's, the color of a deep forest at twilight. Her hair was a shock of white fibers, pulled back tight. She looked at Kaelen with a mixture of desperation and profound disgust. I am Alara, she said, her voice a sharp blade. And as much as it pains my soul to even speak to a scavenger like you, my daughter has calculated that you are our best statistical chance at survival. Survival? Kaelen laughed, a dry, hacking sound. I can barely survive a trip to the latrine, lady. You're looking for a hero, and you found a ghost. We don't need a hero, Ilara said, stepping into the dim light. She placed a small silver canister on the table. It glowed with the soft blue light of high-grade energy cells. We need a body, a human body with enough biological noise to mask Nira's failing signature. In exchange, I will give you enough credits to buy a ship and leave this rock, or enough liquid regret to drown yourself properly. The choice is yours. Kaelen looked at the canister, then at the girl with the gold eyes. Nira wasn't looking at him with hope. She was looking at him like a math problem. 3 days, Nira whispered, and for the first time her chime-like voice trembled. According to my internal sensors, my cellular integrity will reach the point of no return in 72 hours. After that, I simply unravel. Kaelen felt a pang in his chest, a phantom limb of the conscience he thought he'd amputated years ago. He thought of the children he couldn't save in the Orion Belt, the ones he had been ordered to leave behind because they weren't strategic assets. 10 minutes, Kaelen said, standing up. He was a head taller than Ilara, a hulking mass of scarred leather and human stubbornness. I do the job, I get the credits, and I bug out. No questions, no contact, no emotional baggage. Copy that? Crystal, Ilara snapped. Nira hopped off her stool. Excellent. Strategic Phase 1 is complete. Dad, you might want to consider a shower. Your olfactory output is currently at unacceptable levels for imperial boarding. Kaelen stared down at the green child. Don't push it, kid. Nira, she corrected. And welcome to the family, Kaelen. Try not to die before the weekend. It would be highly inconvenient for our schedule. The interior of Ilara's ship, a battered long-range hauler named the Sovereign Nebula, was surprisingly sterile. It was a stark contrast to the filth of the Obsidian Spire. Every tool was magnetized to its rack, and the floors were scrubbed to a dull shine. Kaelen sat on a pressurized crate, wincing as Ilara pressed a biosync collar against his neck. The device felt like a cold snake biting into his carotid artery. Stay still, human, Ilara hissed. If this doesn't seat properly, the Imperial scanners will flag you as a parasite the moment we hit the docking umbilical. Watch the hardware, lady, Kaelen grumbled, his voice strained. I've had enough needles in me to last 3 lifetimes. And the name's Kaelen. Not human, not scavenger. If we're doing this, let's at least get the call signs right. Ilara stepped back, her gold eyes scanning the readout on her handheld terminal. Fine. Kaelen, you are now officially registered as Consort Vane of the Thalassian Auxiliary Line. We met 5 years ago during a trade mission on the Fringe. Nira was born shortly after. It was a scandal, of course, a high-born xylothane mating with a primitive. That explains why we've been living in exile. Primitive, Kaelen muttered. Rich coming from someone whose kid is falling apart at the seams because your perfect DNA can't handle a little mutation. Ilara's hand blurred. Before Kaelen could react, her fingers were locked around his throat. Her strength was terrifying, far beyond what her slender frame suggested. Do not speak of our biology, she whispered, her face inches from his. We are an ancient race. We have built empires that span clusters while your kind were still throwing rocks at each other. Nira's condition is not a weakness. It is a curse inflicted by those who fear her potential. Kaelen didn't struggle. He just looked her in the eye. I've seen empires fall, Ilara. They all think they're special until the oxygen runs out. Now, are we going to do this, or are you going to choke your only ticket onto that ship? She released him, her chest heaving. Nira's in the back, preparing the documentation. We leave at 0400 hours. The Sovereign Nebula docks at the Pinnacle Station for exactly 6 hours to refuel and receive pure citizens for the Festival of Essence. That is our window. Kaelen rubbed his neck. And what if we run into a tango? Some Imperial guard who remembers your face? The Regent, my brother, will be there, Ilara said, her voice turning cold. He is the one who issued the termination order for Nira's father. He believes us dead. We will move through the low-priority queue. With the biosync, he shouldn't be able to distinguish you from a low-ranking xylothane from the outer territories. Unless I talk, Kaelen pointed out. My accent isn't exactly highborn. Then don't talk, Ilara snapped. Act like a typical human consort, Subservient, quiet, and slightly overwhelmed by the majesty of your betters. Subservient, Kaelen echoed, a dangerous glint in his eyes. Yeah, I'm real good at that. It was my best subject in the academy. Nira walked into the cabin carrying two small data slates. She was wearing a ceremonial robe that looked far too heavy for her small frame. The gold embroidery seemed to weigh her down, making her look even paler. Backstory update, Nira announced. I have modified the registry to include a medical history for Kaelen. You were a technician in the fusion labs. You suffered a radiation leak 3 years ago. That will explain the scarring on your hands and why your biosignature is noisy and unstable. It adds a layer of authenticity to our cover. Kaelen looked at the girl. You think of everything, don't you? I have to, Nira said simply. Statistical analysis shows that the probability of success without a human element was 12%. With you, it has risen to 38%. 38? Kaelen scoffed. Those are bad odds, kid. In the military, we call that a suicide mission. In my condition, Nira said, looking up at him, 38% is a miracle. Now we must practice. Dad, please hold my hand. Kaelen hesitated, his large calloused hand hovering over her small green one. He felt a sudden, sharp memory of a field hospital, of a hand much like this one growing cold in his grip. He pushed the thought away and closed his fingers around hers. She was cold, freezing. Your grip is too firm, Nira observed. Fathers of my race hold their offspring with a delicate pressure, signifying guardianship rather than possession. Try again. Kaelen relaxed his hand. Like this? Better. Now look at Mother. Try to project an aura of affection, or at least mutual tolerance. Kaelen glanced at Alara. She was watching them, her expression unreadable. For a fleeting second, the mask of the warrior queen slipped, and he saw the raw, bleeding heart of a mother who would burn the galaxy down to save her child. I can do tolerance, Kaelen said softly. We move in 4 hours, Alara said, turning toward the cockpit. Kaelen, get some rest. If you collapse during the boarding process, I will leave you behind. Wouldn't expect anything else, Kaelen replied. He leaned back against the bulkhead, closing his eyes. He didn't sleep. Instead, he felt the hum of the ship's engines, a vibration that resonated with the biocatalyst in his own blood. He knew what Alara didn't, that the biosync collar was only half the battle. If Nira's heart started to fail, the only thing that would save her was a direct transfusion of his modified, noisy human blood. And he knew the cost. Every milliliter of his blood he gave to a xylothane acted like a high-octane fuel in a low-grade engine. It would heal her, but it would burn him out. He was 42. If he did what he thought he might have to do, he wouldn't see 43. Just 10 minutes, he whispered to the dark. Just 5 minutes of pretending to be someone worth a damn. Outside, the acid rain continued to fall, washing away the tracks of the broken family that wasn't a family at all, headed toward a golden ship that didn't want them. The sovereign nebula did not merely occupy space, it commanded it. As Alara's hauler drifted out of the silent void and into the graviton wake of the Imperial City ship, Kaelen felt a primal shiver travel down his spine. He had seen terrestrial megacities and orbital defense platforms, but this was a different species of architecture altogether. The ship was a sprawling, tiered lattice of white carbon and translucent gold, stretching for over 20 kilometers. It glowed with an internal luminescence that made the surrounding stars look like dim embers. It was a cathedral built for the stars, a monument to a race that believed they had conquered death through the sheer force of their lineage. Sitrep is looking grim, Kaelen thought, leaning against the cold metal of the cockpit bulkhead. He watched the tiny flickers of light that were patrol ships buzzing around the nebula like angry hornets. Every one of those ships was piloted by a warrior who had been genetically optimized since the zygote stage to recognize a threat before it even manifested. Alara's hands were tight on the flight controls. She hadn't spoken for the last 3 hours, her focus entirely consumed by the delicate dance of matching the nebula's erratic rotation. Behind them, Nira was seated in a crash couch, her small fingers flying across a holographic display. The light of the data streams reflected in her gold eyes, making her look like a ghost caught in a web of numbers. We are approaching the primary docking umbilical for the zenith sector, Nira said. Her voice was steady, but there was a faint rasp to it that hadn't been there yesterday. I have synchronized our fake credentials with the station's local mesh. We are currently identified as refugees from the Gorvex mining collapse. It is a messy narrative, but messiness provides cover. The imperial officials expect refugees to be disorganized and traumatized. Stay frosty, Kaelen said, his voice a low rumble. He adjusted the biosync collar around his neck. It felt like a hot wire was buried in his skin. The device was working overtime to mask his human heartbeat, replacing the jagged, irregular rhythm of his species with the smooth, melodic pulse of a xylothane. If that thing glitches, we are done. Not just deported, we are talking permanent termination. The probability of a hardware failure is less than 2%, Nira replied, though she didn't look up from her screens. The probability of human error, however, remains at 34%. Try not to sweat, Dad. Xylothane do not possess active sweat glands in high-stress environments. It is considered a sign of biological inferiority. Copy that, kid, Kaelen muttered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. No sweating, subservient, quiet. I am a regular piece of imperial furniture. The ship shuddered as the magnetic grapples of the Pinnacle station locked onto their hull. There was a sickening groan of metal, a sound that reminded Kaelen of a wounded animal, and then silence. The artificial gravity of the station took over, pulling at his boots with a deceptive softness. Ilara stood up, her cloak swirling around her feet. She looked at Kaelen, her expression a mask of cold iron, but he saw the flicker of a tremor in her jaw. This is it, she whispered. Once we cross the threshold, there is no turning back. If they separate us, stay calm. If they ask about the marriage, tell them we were joined under the rites of the pale moon. It is a common ritual for the lower castes. Understood, Kaelen said. He stepped toward the airlock, his boots echoing on the deck. He felt like he was walking toward a firing squad. The airlock hissed open, and the scent of the Sovereign Nebula hit him like a physical blow. It didn't smell like a ship. It smelled like a forest after a summer rain, ozone, wet earth, and the sweet, cloying aroma of bioluminescent flowers. The walls of the docking bay were made of a living, pearlescent material that seemed to pulse with a slow, deep heartbeat. Ahead of them, a line of refugees stretched toward a towering crystalline arch. At the base of the arch stood the imperial inspectors. They were tall, elegant beings with skin the color of polished jade, wearing armor that looked like it had been grown rather than forged. They held scanning staves that hummed with a low-frequency vibration, a sound that made Kaelen's teeth ache. Movement, Ilara commanded, her voice barely a breath. They fell into line. Kaelen kept his head down, his shoulders slumped in the posture of a man who had lost everything. He felt Nara's small hand slip into his. Her fingers were like ice, trembling with a frantic, rhythmic beat. He squeezed her hand back, not with the delicate guardianship she had instructed, but with the firm, grounding weight of a soldier holding a comrade in a foxhole. Next, a voice boomed. It was a beautiful sound, like a cello being played in an empty hall, but it held no mercy. They stepped forward. The inspector was a female with eyes like cold emeralds. She didn't look at their faces. She looked at the data slates they presented and the biosignatures pulsing from their collars. She ran her scanning staff over Nira first. The device emitted a soft, green chime. Nira of House Thalassian, the inspector read from the display. Biological integrity, marginal. Loom wilt? Yes, Excellency, Ilara said, her voice a perfect blend of humility and grief. We have traveled from the outer rim in search of the essence. We have nothing left but our devotion to the crown. The inspector's eyes shifted to Ilara, then finally to Kaelen. The scanning staff hovered over his chest. Kaelen held his breath, praying that the biosync collar wouldn't blow a fuse. The machine hummed. For a long, agonizing second, the light on the staff flickered between blue and red. Kaelen felt a drop of sweat roll down the side of his face. He caught a glimpse of Ilara's hand tightening on her cloak. Problem, Excellency? Kaelen asked, keeping his voice flat and weary. The inspector narrowed her eyes. Your signature is turbulent. It lacks the harmonic resonance of a pure citizen. The fusion labs, Kaelen said, pointing to the scars on his hands. 2 decades in the core rooms of Gorvex. My blood has been humming with radiation since the girl was a toddler. It is a wonder I can stand at all. The inspector looked at the scars, then back at the data slate. The record Nira had fabricated was holding. The fusion leak was a documented event, a tragedy of the working class. The turbulence is consistent with long-term isotopic exposure, the inspector muttered, her voice tinged with a faint note of pity, or perhaps just the distaste a person feels for a broken tool. Very well. Complete family unit confirmed. Proceed to the Zenith Quarter for quarantine and evaluation. She stepped aside. Kaelen didn't move until Alara gave his arm a sharp tug. They walked through the crystalline arch and into a hallway that looked like it had been carved from the heart of a giant opal. As the heavy doors hissed shut behind them, Kaelen felt the tension leave his body in a rush that made him dizzy. 10 minutes, he whispered, his voice shaking. We made it. No, Nira said, her voice thin and fragile as she leaned against his leg. We have only crossed the perimeter. The real battle is in the marrow. She didn't finish the sentence. Her hand slipped from his and she slumped toward the floor. Kaelen caught her before she hit the ground, his medic instincts screaming as he felt the sudden, terrifying heat radiating from her skin. The loom wilt was no longer a slow decay. It was a fire, and it was beginning to consume her from the inside out. The guest quarters in the Zenith Quarter were a nightmare of luxury. The walls were draped in silk woven from spider glass, and the floor was a mosaic of emerald tiles that felt warm to the touch. In the center of the room, a fountain flowed with nutrient-rich water that smelled of jasmine and ancient earth. To any other refugee, it would have been a paradise. To Kaelen, it was a gilded cage where he could hear the clock ticking. He laid Nira on the low, circular bed. Her breathing was coming in short, jagged gasps that rattled in her chest. The vibrant green of her skin was fading, replaced by a dull, ashen gray that reminded Kaelen of a dying sun. Alara was pacing the room like a caged animal, her hands tangled in her hair. This wasn't supposed to happen yet, she whispered, her voice cracking. The calculations said she had 3 days, 2 at the minimum. Why is it accelerating? Biology doesn't give a damn about your calculations, Alara, Kaelen said, his voice sharp and focused. He was already kneeling by the bed, his hands moving over Nira's body with practiced efficiency. He didn't have his medical kit, but he had his eyes and his experience. This is a systemic collapse. The stress of the boarding, the biosync interference, it's pushed her over the edge. Her cells are unraveling faster than they can replicate. Alara stopped pacing and stared at him. You are a human doctor. Do something. Use your primitive science. Save her. I'm a combat medic, Kaelen snapped. I patch holes and stop bleeding. This isn't a wound, Alara. It's a structural failure. I need the essence of revival. Now. We can't get to the essence vault until the festival begins tomorrow evening, Alara said, her eyes wide with terror. If we move now, the guards will flag us. We are in quarantine. The doors are locked from the outside. Then she isn't going to make it to the morning, Kaelen said flatly. He looked down at Nira. Her gold eyes were half open, clouded with pain. She looked so small against the vast ornate bed. She was a genius, a strategist, a royal-born aristocrat. But in this moment, she was just a child who was afraid to die. Dad, she whispered. The word was a ghost of a sound. I'm here, sweetheart, Kaelen said. He took her hand. It felt like holding a handful of dry leaves. Is this a snafu? She asked, her voice hitching. Kaelen managed a small, sad smile. Yeah, kid. It is a major Charlie Foxtrot, the biggest one I've seen in a long time. Nira let out a weak, rattling breath that might have been a laugh. I suspected as much. The variables were too volatile. Kaelen looked at Alara. She was frozen, her face a mask of grief. He realized then that she had no plan for this. She was a woman who lived by rules and hierarchies, and when the rules broke, she broke with them. He was the only one in the room who knew how to operate in the chaos. Alara, listen to me, Kaelen said, his voice dropping into the steady, commanding tone he had used in the trenches of the Orion Belt. I have something in my blood. It's a biocatalyst. The military used it to keep soldiers on their feet when their organs were failing. It's messy, it's illegal, and it's dangerous as hell for a xylothane. A biocatalyst? Alara stepped closer, her eyes narrowed. You mean a mutational agent? Call it whatever you want, Kaelen said. My blood is full of it. If I can get it into her system, it might act as a bridge. It won't cure the loom wilt, but it might slow down the decay long enough for us to reach the vault. It's a temporary patch, a field dressing for her DNA. Ilara's face went pale. You want to put human blood into my daughter? The pollution, the genetic noise. It could kill her instantly. The loom wilt is already killing her, Ilara, Kaelen shouted, his patience snapping. She has maybe 2 hours left. My blood is a gamble. Doing nothing is a certainty. Now, are you going to stand there and talk about genetic purity, or are you going to let me try to save your daughter? Ilara looked at Nira, then back at Kaelen. She saw the scars on his hands, the silver at his temples, and the absolute unwavering determination in his eyes. She saw a man who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, offering the only thing he had left. Do it, she whispered. Kaelen didn't waste a second. He pulled a small, jagged piece of metal from the lining of his leather coat, a makeshift lancet he'd kept hidden. He cleaned it with a splash of the jasmine-scented water from the fountain, though he knew it was a symbolic gesture at best. He looked at his own arm, finding the thick vein in the crook of his elbow. He had done this before, in the dark, under heavy fire, with the smell of cordite in the air. This time, the silence of the room was far more terrifying. He sliced his skin. The blood was a deep, rich crimson, a sharp contrast to the pale emerald of the room. He didn't have a syringe, but he had a piece of tubing he had scavenged from the hauler's life support system. He improvised a gravity-fed line, connecting his arm to a small port on Nira's biosync collar that allowed for emergency nutrient injections. As the first drops of his blood entered the tubing, Kaelen felt a wave of exhaustion hit him. The biocatalyst wasn't just a substance, it was a part of his life force. Giving it away was like pouring his own years into a glass. Nira gasped. Her body convulsed on the bed, her back arching as the human blood hit her system. It was like fire meeting ice, a violent, chaotic reaction that sent ripples of light under her skin. Kaelen, Ilara screamed, reaching for her daughter. Stay back, Kaelen roared. It has to cycle. He watched Nira's face. The gray was fighting the red. For a long, terrifying minute, it looked like the gray would win. Her heart rate monitor, a small holographic pulse on her wrist, went into a flatline scream. Come on, kid, Kaelen whispered, his vision blurring. Don't you dare quit on me. You still have 3 advanced degrees to earn. You still have to revolutionize those fields of science. Don't let the numbers win. Then the flatline broke. The pulse returned, slow at first, then steadying into a strong rhythmic beat. The ashen gray retreated, and a flush of healthy green returned to her cheeks. Nira's eyes flew open. They were no longer clouded. They were bright gold, reflecting the crimson of the blood still flowing through the tube. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The rattling in her chest was gone. Bioanalysis. Complete, she whispered, her voice stronger now. The human catalyst is highly inefficient. It is chaotic. It lacks symmetry. Kaelen let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He pulled the tubing from his arm and pressed a scrap of silk against the wound. But it worked, didn't it? It is acceptable, Nira said, her lips curving into a tiny, exhausted smile. Thank you, Dad. Kaelen slumped against the side of the bed, his head spinning. He felt 20 years older than he had 10 minutes ago. Every joint in his body ached, and his heart felt like it was struggling to move through mud. But as he looked at Nira, who was now breathing easily, he felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. It wasn't the biocatalyst. It was something else. Ilara knelt beside him. She looked at the blood on his arm, then at her daughter. She reached out and touched Kaelen's shoulder. Her hand was no longer cold or commanding. It was shaking. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do that for her? You don't know us. We are nothing to you but a contract. Kaelen looked at her, his eyes heavy with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. 5 years ago, I was ordered to leave a village full of people behind because saving them wasn't statistically significant. I spent the last 5 years telling myself that the numbers were right, that I was just one man and I couldn't change the outcome. He looked at Nira, who had fallen into a deep, natural sleep. I was wrong, Alara. The numbers are never right when it comes to a life. I didn't save her because of a contract. I saved her because she asked me to be her father. And fathers don't look at the probability of success. They just do the job. Elora looked away, her jaw tightening. For a moment, the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of things unsaid. The cultural divide between them, thousands of light years wide, felt like it was beginning to crumble. Get some rest, Kaelen, she said, her voice soft. Tomorrow we go to the vault. Tomorrow we finish this. Kaelen nodded, his eyes already closing. He didn't tell her that he wasn't sure he could stand up again. He didn't tell her that he could feel his own life signature fracturing, the way Mira would later describe it. He just let himself drift into a dark, dreamless sleep, wrapped in the scent of jasmine and the steady, borrowed heartbeat of a girl who had become his daughter by choice, if not by blood. The sovereign nebula hummed around them, a golden city of rules and ancient laws, unaware that in one of its guest rooms, the symmetry had been broken by a man who was tired of being useless. The morning of the Festival of Essence did not arrive with a sunrise. On the Sovereign Nebula, time was a curated experience, dictated by the shifting hues of the bioluminescent ceiling. Today, the canopy of the zenith quarter glowed with a deep, regal violet, the color of ancient blood and highborn authority. Kaelen woke on the floor beside Naira's bed, his body feeling as though it had been disassembled and put back together by an amateur mechanic. Every joint sang with a dull, throbbing ache. The skin on his arm, where he had improvised the transfusion, was a bruised purple, the puncture wound refusing to close properly. He checked his internal sight rep. Vision was blurry around the edges. Pulse was erratic, skipping every fourth beat like a glitched chronometer. Sit rep. Fubar, he croaked, pushing himself up. Biological assessment confirms your self-diagnosis, Nira said. She was sitting up, her emerald skin vibrant once more, her gold eyes tracking him with a frighteningly sharp focus. Your cellular stability has dropped by 32% since the transfusion. You are essentially running on fumes, Kaelen. I've run on less, Kaelen grunted, reaching for a flask of water. I once spent 48 hours in a mud trench in the Orion Belt with a piece of shrapnel in my lung and nothing but synthetic caffeine tabs to keep me awake. I'm fine, kid. Just a bit of rust in the gears. You are not fine, Alara said, emerging from the shadows of the balcony. She was already dressed in her ceremonial silks, the dark green fabric clinging to her like a second skin. She looked every bit the princess she had once been, but her eyes were fixed on Kaelen's bruised arm with an expression that bordered on guilt. The catalyst in your blood. It is consuming you to keep her alive. I can see the gray in your hair spreading. Kaelen caught his reflection in the fountain surface. She was right. The silver at his temples had marched forward, a silent army claiming more territory. He looked 50 years old, though the calendar in his head insisted he was only 42. Price of the ticket, Kaelen said, shrugging. Now what's the plan? We've got a vault to crack and about 10,000 angry emerald skins between us and the finish line. The festival begins at 1800 hours, Alara explained, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. The regent will lead a procession from the Grand Spire to the Essence Vault. It is the only time the outer seals are deactivated for ritual cleansing. We will blend with the pilgrims from the outer sectors. They are commoners, scruffy and disorganized. They won't look twice at a human consort as long as you stay 2 paces behind me and keep your mouth shut. Pilgrim routine. Got it, Kaelen said. He looked at Nira. Can you walk? I can sprint if the tactical situation requires it, Nira said, sliding off the bed. Her movements were fluid again. The lethal grace of the xylothane returned in full force. The human catalyst has provided a significant, albeit temporary, physiological overclock. I estimate I have 24 hours of peak performance before the loom wilt resumes its erosion. Then we don't waste a second, Kaelen said. They left the guest quarters, moving into the main thoroughfares of the Zenith Quarter. The ship was alive with movement. Thousands of xylothane filled the streets, their colorful silks creating a shifting mosaic of wealth and power. Musicians played instruments made of singing glass, the sounds vibrating through the floor and into Kaelen's very bones. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense and the metallic tang of high-energy shields. As they approached the grand spire, the crowd grew denser. Kaelen felt 1,000 eyes on him, cold, golden eyes that judged his human skin and his tattered leather coat. He felt the biosync collar around his neck humming, working overtime to mask the noise of his blood. "Stay close," Alara murmured. Suddenly the music stopped. A hush fell over the crowd, so absolute that Kaelen could hear the hum of the ship's life support systems. At the top of the grand spire, a figure appeared. Regent Valen was a mountain of a man, even by Xylothane standards. His skin was the color of dark jade, and his robes were woven from pure sunlight. He didn't walk, he glided, his presence radiating a cold, gravitational authority that seemed to pull the very air from the room. "My people," Valen's voice boomed, amplified by hidden emitters. "Today we celebrate the symmetry. We celebrate the blood that binds us and the essence that sustains us. Let no impurity tarnish our light." Valen's gaze swept over the crowd. For a heartbeat, those cold emerald eyes seemed to lock on to Kaelen. Kaelen didn't blink. He used his military training to relax his muscles, to become just another shadow in the throng. Beside him, he felt Alara stiffen, her hand gripping Naira's shoulder so hard her knuckles turned white. Valen raised a hand and the procession began. They moved toward the Essence Vault, a massive structure of black obsidian located at the very heart of the ship's biological core. It was guarded by the Praetorian Guard, warriors in heavy power armor, their staves crackling with enough energy to vaporize a human in a single strike. As they neared the entrance, a security drone drifted over their heads. It was a sleek, eye-shaped device that emitted a soft blue light as it scanned the pilgrims. "Scanning," a synthesized voice announced. "Unit 47, verified. Unit 48, verified." The drone hovered over Kaelen. "Unit 49, warning, biological signature shows high-frequency interference. Isotopic exposure detected. Consort vein, human. Scan status, inconclusive." The crowd around them slowed. A Praetorian guard turned, his visor glowing red as he leveled his staff at Kaelen's chest. "Identify," the guard commanded. Kaelen felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. "Consort vein," he said, his voice a weary rasp. "Gorvex Fusion Labs. I've got more radiation in my marrow than a spent fuel rod. My collar's glitched, not my heart." "He is with me," Alara said, stepping forward. She held herself with an icy dignity that made the guard hesitate. "He is a broken man, but he is a loyal one. Would you deny a dying laborer his last chance to witness the essence?" The guard looked at Alara, then at Kaelen's scarred hands. He seemed to be weighing the risk of a scandal against the protocol of his orders. "The human is a glitch," a voice said. The crowd parted. Regent Valen stood there, his robes shimmering. He looked down at them with a detached curiosity, like a scientist examining a particularly interesting species of mold. "Sister," Valen said, his voice a low, dangerous purr, "I thought I recognized the scent of failure." "Valen," Ilara replied, her voice steady, "I am a citizen of this empire. I have a right to be here. A citizen, yes. But a mother?" Valen looked at Nira. He reached out a long green finger and tilted her chin up. "The loom wilt is a cruel mistress. She does not care for rights or legacies. She only cares for the end." "She is alive, Valen," Ilara snapped. "For now," Valen agreed. He turned his attention back to Kaelen. "And this human, you found a scavenger to play the role of a father? How desperate, how very unsymmetric." "He is more of a man than you will ever be," Alara whispered. Valen laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "A man? He is a bag of leaking chemicals. He is a walking radiation hazard." Valen leaned in closer to Kaelen. "Tell me, human, what do they pay you to play this game? Credits? A ship? Or did my sister offer you something more intimate?" Kaelen felt the anger flare in his gut, a hot, bright spark that burned through his fatigue. He looked the regent in the eye, a human looking at a god. "I'm doing it for 5 minutes, Your Highness," Kaelen said, his voice like grinding gravel. "That was the deal. 5 minutes of pretending that this ship isn't a graveyard for people too afraid of their own shadows." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Valen seemed taken aback by the sheer, blunt audacity of the statement. Bold, Valen murmured. But boldness does not fix a broken bloodline. Guards, take them to the secondary holding area. I will deal with my sister's indiscretions after the ceremony. Valen, no, Ilara cried. The Praetorian guards stepped forward, their staves humming. Kaelen felt the weight of the situation crashing down. If they were taken now, Nira would die in a holding cell. The mission would be over. The family would be deleted. Dad, Nira whispered. Kaelen looked at her. She wasn't looking at him as a strategist. She was looking at him for a miracle. Sit rep update, Kaelen muttered under his breath. Extraction required. He didn't wait for permission. Kaelen swung his heavy leather coat, using the thick material to deflect the first guard's staff. The energy discharge sizzled through the leather, burning his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He stepped inside the guard's reach and delivered a military-grade headbutt to the warrior's visor. Crack. The guard stumbled back. Move! Kaelen roared. He grabbed Ilara and Nira, shoving them toward a narrow service hatch he had spotted earlier, a maintenance access for the ship's cooling systems. Stop them! Valen shouted, his voice cracking with rage. Energy bolts hissed through the air, melting the obsidian walls around them. Kaelen felt a searing pain in his thigh as a bolt grazed him, but he kept moving. He threw the hatch open and shoved the women inside. Down the chute! Go! He followed them in, slamming the hatch shut and locking it from the inside just as a heavy blow hammered against the metal. They slid down a dark, steep pipe, the smell of recycled water and ozone filling their lungs. They tumbled out into a sprawling, subterranean chamber, the ship's biological filtration level. It was a forest of translucent pipes and glowing fungal colonies, a dark, humid world that existed beneath the golden surface of the nebula. Kaelen groaned as he tried to stand. His leg was bleeding, and his vision was swimming. He looked at Ilara and Nira. They were shaken, their silks torn and stained with grime, but they were alive. Well, Kaelen panted, leaning against a pulsating fungal stalk. That went about as well as a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. You struck an imperial guard, Ilara said, her eyes wide with shock. You spoke to the regent as an equal. Do you have any idea what you've done? Yeah, Kaelen said, wiping blood from his forehead. I did my job. I acted like a father, and a father doesn't let some green-skinned prick talk down to his family. Ilara stared at him. The disgust was gone. In its place was something new, a realization that made her look away. We are trapped in the filtration levels, Nira said, her voice small but steady. The probability of reaching the vault from here is less than 8%. 8%? Kaelen managed a weak grin. Those are the best odds I've had all week. Now let's get moving before the sardines catch up to us. The filtration levels of the Sovereign Nebula were a labyrinth of biological engineering. Huge translucent bladders the size of houses hung from the ceiling, pulsing with the rhythmic flow of nutrient-rich fluids. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the low-frequency hum of the ship's internal veins. They had been moving for 3 hours. Kaelen was limping heavily now, his leg wound bound with a strip of silk torn from Ilara's robe. Every step felt like a nail being driven into his hip. The biosync collar was sparking occasionally, sending sharp jolts of electricity into his neck, but he couldn't take it off. Without it, the ship's internal sensors would find him in seconds. Wait, Kaelen whispered, holding up a hand. They froze in the shadow of a massive filtration pump. Above them, they could hear the rhythmic clank of boots on the metal catwalks. The Praetorian guards were sweeping the levels, their scanning lights cutting through the darkness like pale blue swords. They are closing the perimeter, Nira whispered. She was perched on a pipe, her gold eyes scanning the data stream she had intercepted from a nearby terminal. They have deployed 3 squads to this sector. Estimated time to contact, 12 minutes. We need a way up, Ilara said, her eyes searching the ceiling. The essence vault is directly above us, but the access shafts are guarded. Kaelen looked at the filtration pumps. They were massive machines that pulled fluid from the lower levels and pushed it toward the medical wing. Those pumps, Kaelen said, pointing to a series of vertical tubes. Where do they lead? They supply the ethel core, Nira said, her brow furrowed. But the pressure is immense. A biological entity would be crushed within 5 seconds of entering the stream. Not if we bypass the primary valves, Kaelen said. He looked at Ilara. You're a mechanic, right? You told me you worked in the docks for 8 years. Ilara nodded. I know fluid dynamics, but Kaelen, those systems are designed for xylothane biology. Your human frame won't hold up under the G-force. I'm already falling apart, Ilara, Kaelen said, his voice flat. One more trip through the spin cycle isn't going to make a difference. Can you reroute the flow? Ilara looked at the control panel near the pump. Her fingers hovered over the bioluminescent keys. I can create a cavitation bubble, a small pocket of air within the fluid stream. If we time it perfectly, it could carry us up to the medical level. But it will be violent. Violent is my middle name, Kaelen said. They moved toward the pump. As Ilara worked on the controls, Kaelen sat on the floor, his back against a cold pipe. He felt a sudden wave of fatigue so powerful it felt like a physical weight pressing him into the earth. His vision went black for a moment, and his heart skipped 3 beats in a row. Kaelen? He opened his eyes. Naira was standing over him. She wasn't analyzing him this time. She looked worried. It was a human expression on a green face, and it startled him. Your life signature is flickering, Naira said quietly. The human catalyst is depleted. You are giving me everything you have left, aren't you? Kaelen looked at the girl. I'm just doing the math, Naira. You've got 80 years of life ahead of you. I've had 42. Most of mine were spent in the dirt. Yours shouldn't be. But it is not logical, Naira insisted, her voice trembling. Why would you trade your existence for a fragment of mine? We are not even the same species. There is no biological imperative for this sacrifice. Kaelen reached out and touched her cheek. His hand was trembling, but his touch was gentle. That's where you're wrong, kid. Biology has nothing to do with it. You asked me to be your dad, and once you ask that, once someone chooses you, you don't look at the numbers anymore. You just stay until the job is done. Naira stared at him, her gold eyes wide. A single crystalline tear rolled down her emerald cheek. It wasn't an imperial reaction. It was a choice. I've finished the override, Ilara called out, her voice tight with tension. The cavitation bubble will hold for exactly 40 seconds. We have to enter the intake now. They climbed into the intake manifold, a cramped, dark space that smelled of salt and chemicals. Kaelen pulled Naira close to his chest, shielding her with his body. Ilara braced herself against the opposite wall, her hand finding Kaelen's in the dark. If we don't make it, Ilara whispered. We'll make it, Kaelen said. I've got a date with a first edition book in a very expensive bottle of scotch. I'm not missing it for a plumbing accident. Then the world exploded. The intake valves slammed shut, and a wall of fluid hit them with the force of a high-speed collision. Kaelen felt his ribs groan under the pressure. The cavitation bubble was a tiny, shaking pocket of air in a roaring ocean of nutrient sludge. They were being propelled upward at a terrifying speed, the G-force pinning them against the walls. Kaelen squeezed Naira harder, his own body absorbing the shocks and vibrations. He felt his biosync collar shatter, the shards of metal slicing into his neck. He didn't care. He could feel Naira's heartbeat against his chest, steady, strong, and fueled by his own blood. 30 seconds. 35. The world tilted and suddenly they were being vomited out onto a hard white floor. Kaelen tumbled across the tiles, his lungs screaming for air. He coughed up a mouthful of blue fluid and looked around. They were in a large, silent chamber filled with columns of light. In the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating crystal, the ethel core. They were inside the essence vault. We did it, Ilara wheezed, pushing herself up. She looked around the vault, her eyes wide with awe. The essence. It's right there. Naira was already moving toward the central pedestal. She looked stronger than she had in weeks, the human catalyst still pulsing through her veins. Accessing the essence of revival, Naira said, her fingers dancing over the crystal surface. Calibration in progress. 3 minutes to extraction. Kaelen tried to stand, but his legs gave way. He slumped against a column of light, his chest heaving. He looked at his hands. They were pale, the skin thin and translucent. He could see his own veins, and they weren't red anymore. They were a faint, sickly pink. Kaelen! Ilara was at his side in an instant. She saw the state he was in and gasped. The collar, it's gone. Your signature is exposed. Doesn't matter, Kaelen whispered. She's getting the cure. A heavy thud echoed through the vault. The primary doors were being hammered by something immense. A thermal drill was beginning to cut through the obsidian, sending sparks flying into the room. "They're here," Kaelen said, reaching for a discarded power staff he had spotted near the entrance. "Ilara, get the essence. Get Naira and get to the maintenance tunnels. There's an emergency shuttle in the medical wing." "I am not leaving you," Ilara said, her voice hard. "You have to," Kaelen said. He looked her in the eye, and for the first time, he saw the woman behind the princess. He saw the love and the fear and the gratitude. "She needs a mother, Ilara. She doesn't need two ghosts." "You are not a ghost yet, Kaelen Cole," Ilara said. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. It was a xylothane gesture of profound intimacy, the merging of thoughts. "You are the father of my child, and I will not let you go easily." "Extraction complete," Naira shouted. She held a small silver canister that glowed with an intense golden light. "We have the essence!" The vault doors shattered. Regent Valen stepped through the smoke, followed by a dozen Praetorian guards. He looked around the vault, his eyes landing on the silver canister in Naira's hand. "Enough of this farce," Valen said, his voice cold as the void. "Give me the essence, child, and perhaps I will allow the human to die with some dignity." Kaelen used the power staff to push himself up. He stood between Valen and the two women, his legs shaking but his grip on the staff firm. He looked like an old man, his hair entirely silver, his face etched with the lines of 20 years of stolen time. "You want the essence, Your Highness?" Kaelen asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You'll have to go through the dad first," Valen sneered. "A bold speech for a man whose heart is about to stop." "My heart is doing just fine," Kaelen said. He felt a sudden, strange warmth spreading from his chest. It wasn't the biocatalyst. It was something deeper, something ancient. "Because it's not just mine anymore." He raised the staff, the energy humming at his fingertips. He knew he only had one shot, one burst of energy before his system shut down for good. "Run," Kaelen whispered to Ilara. "No," Naira said. She stepped forward and took Kaelen's hand. "We are a complete unit, Dad, and a family doesn't leave its members behind." Kaelen looked at the girl, then at Ilara. They both stood beside him, their hands on his shoulders, their own biosignatures merging with his noisy, turbulent human spirit. Valen's expression shifted from arrogance to something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Praetorians!" Valen roared. "Kill them all!" Kaelen didn't wait for the guards to move. He slammed the power staff into the floor, channeling every remaining ounce of his life force, his biocatalyst, and his sheer, stubborn human will into the ship's biological core. The light that erupted from him was not green. It was a brilliant, blinding crimson, the color of a heart that refused to stop. The crimson shockwave that erupted from Kaelen vein did not just illuminate the essence vault, it rewrote the physics of the room. The ethel core, a massive crystalline spire of ancient xylothane memory, had spent 10,000 years vibrating at a precise, mathematical frequency. It was a monolith of order, a library of genetic perfection that had never known a single note of discord. Kaelen's human blood, supercharged by the military-grade biocatalyst, was the ultimate discord. It was a scream of chaotic evolution in a room built for silent, stagnant symmetry. Regent Valen was thrown backward by the sheer kinetic force of the pulse. His Praetorian guards, whose armor was designed to harmonize with the ship's internal energy fields, found their systems suddenly jammed by the jagged, irregular frequency of Kaelen's biosignature. They stumbled, their power staves flickering and hissing as the emerald light was swallowed by the encroaching red. Sitrep. Total chaos, Kaelen thought, but he couldn't find the breath to say it. He was still upright, his hand fused to the power staff by a static discharge, but his heart felt like it was being squeezed by a giant's fist. His vision was a kaleidoscope of fractured gold and deep, bruised crimson. He could feel the ethel core fighting him, trying to purge the human noise from its system, but he held on. He held on because he could feel Naira's hand still gripping his, her small fingers anchoring him to the present. "You are hurting," Naira whispered into the silence of his mind. The cortex patch, damaged by the blast, was no longer translating words. It was translating raw emotion. She was feeling the fire in his veins, the way his cells were screaming as they burned through 20 years of his future in a matter of seconds. "Don't look at the gauges, kid," Kaelen projected back, a grim mental smile. "Just watch the exit." Valen scrambled to his feet, his jade skin flushed with a dark, angry purple. "Impurity!" he shrieked, his voice losing its cello-like resonance and turning into a jagged blade. "You have poisoned the core. You have brought the filth of the mud planets into the heart of our divinity." He raised his hand, and a concealed weapon in his gauntlet began to hum with a lethal, concentrated violet light. "Praetorians, execute them. Forget the essence. Destroy the source of the infection." The guards, recovering from the initial shock, began to close in. Their visors were dark, their movements robotic. They didn't see a family. They saw a biological hazard. Kaelen felt Alara move beside him. She wasn't the broken mechanic anymore. She wasn't the grieving widow. She was a hurricane. She had snatched a discarded staff from the floor, and despite her lack of formal training with the weapon, she swung it with a desperation that was more dangerous than skill. "If you want my daughter, Valen," Alara roared, her voice echoing off the obsidian walls, "you will have to walk through the ruins of your own empire." She met the first guard in a shower of sparks. The collision of their weapons sent a jolt through the floor that Kaelen felt in his teeth. Alara was outmatched, but she was fighting with a ferocity that made the guard hesitate. She wasn't fighting for honor or for the crown. She was fighting for the 2 minutes Naira needed to finish the calibration. "Naira, the canister!" Kaelen gasped, his voice a wet, rattling sound. The girl didn't hesitate. She held the silver canister toward the pulsating ethel core. The crystal spire was no longer glowing with its serene imperial green. It was swirling with a turbulent, angry mix of gold and red. The human biocatalyst had opened the vault's locks by force, confusing the ancient machinery into thinking a total system reboot was underway. "The essence is responding," Nira said, her voice strained. "But it lacks a bridge. The data stream is too fragmented. It needs a biological conduit to stabilize the transfer. It needs a heart to set the rhythm." Kaelen knew what she meant. He looked at the canister, then at his own arm, where the veins were bulging with the dying light of his own life force. The essence of revival was just information, raw genetic potential. It needed a living template to shape it into a cure. It needed someone to tell the DNA how to heal. "A bridge," Kaelen whispered. He looked at Alara, who was being driven back by 2 guards, her silks tattered, her skin scorched. He looked at Nira, whose gold eyes were wide with a sudden, terrible realization. "No, Dad," Nira said, her voice breaking. "The probability of survival if you act as the conduit is 0.001%. It will drain you. It will take everything." "Since when do we care about the odds, sweetheart?" Kaelen asked. He didn't wait for her to calculate a rebuttal. He let go of the power staff and plunged his hand directly into the light of the ethel core's central aperture. The world disappeared. There was no vault. There was no Valen. There was only a roaring river of information. Kaelen felt 10,000 years of xylothane history crashing through his mind. Their wars, their art, their arrogance, and their profound, silent loneliness. And in the middle of it all, he felt a small, flickering light. Naira. He took his own life, his human resilience, his memories of Earth's oceans, the smell of rain on a dusty road, and the feeling of a cold beer on a hot afternoon, and he threw them into the river. He used his own humanity as a filter, stripping away the stagnant perfection of the xylothane and replacing it with the messy, stubborn will to survive. He felt his body aging. He felt his joints stiffen, his skin wrinkle, his eyes cloud over. He felt decades of time being torn from his bones and fed into the machine. 50 years, 60, 70. The cost didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the bridge. A golden light erupted from the canister in Nira's hand, so bright it swallowed the violet of Valen's weapon and the darkness of the guard's visors. It was the color of a sunrise on a planet that had never known a night. The essence was no longer a mystery, it was a command. Heal, Kaelen thought, with the last fragment of his conscious mind. Heal the kid. The light surged through him and into Naira. She gasped, her body arching as the restored DNA flooded her system, repairing the loom wilt with the efficiency of 1,000 microscopic architects. The gray tinge vanished from her skin, replaced by a vibrant, healthy green that glowed with a new, human-infused vitality. Kaelen fell. He hit the floor like a sack of stones, his heart slowing to a crawl. He was dimly aware of the sound of the vault's alarm systems, a high-pitched scream that signaled the total collapse of the Sovereign Nebula's medical grid. Violin stood over him, his weapon trembling in his hand. "You! You monster," the Regent whispered, his voice full of a horror that was almost religious. "You have changed her. She is no longer pure. She is like you." "She's better than me," Kaelen managed to wheeze, his voice sounding like it was coming from 100 miles away. "She's my daughter." Valen raised his weapon to deliver the final strike, but he never got the chance. Ilara was there. She didn't use a staff. She didn't use a weapon. She used the raw, kinetic energy of her own body, slamming into her brother with the force of a falling star. They tumbled toward the edge of the Ethel Core's containment pit, a dark abyss that led directly to the ship's engine core. "Ilara!" Kaelen tried to scream, but only a puff of air escaped his lungs. She caught the edge of the pit with one hand, her other hand locked around Valen's throat. The Regent's eyes were wide with terror as he stared down into the white-hot light of the engines. "Finish it, sister," Valen hissed. "For the symmetry." "No," Ilara said, her voice cold and clear. "For my family. She didn't drop him. She didn't kill him. She simply looked at him with a pity that was more devastating than any blade. She pulled herself up, dragging Valen with her, and then shoved him toward his cowering guards. "The symmetry is dead, Valen," Ilara said, standing tall amidst the ruins of the vault. "It died the moment a human gave his life for a child you were too afraid to love. Get out, before I decide that mercy is a human trait I haven't quite mastered yet." Valen looked at his sister, at the glowing, healthy girl beside her, and at the ancient, silver-haired man dying on the floor. He saw the future, and for the first time in his life, he saw that he had no place in it. He turned and fled, his guards following like shadows into the smoke. Ilara and Naira were at Kaelen's side in a heartbeat. "Dad?" Naira whispered, her hand trembling as she touched his face. "Dad, stay with us. The transfer is done." "You did it." Kaelen looked up at her. His vision was almost gone, but he could see her eyes, gold, bright, and full of the messy, illogical tears of a girl who had just learned what it meant to be loved. 5 minutes, Kaelen whispered, his voice a ghost. That was the deal. 5 minutes became forever, Naira said, her voice breaking. Kaelen smiled, a slow, tired movement that felt like the most difficult thing he had ever done. "Sit rep. Positive," he muttered. Then the darkness finally claimed him. The evacuation of the Sovereign Nebula was not a structured event. It was a scramble, a panic of the highborn as the ship's biological core began to reject its own life support systems. The pollution of Kaelen's sacrifice had triggered a cascading reboot that the Imperial engineers couldn't stop. The city ship was literally falling apart, its golden lattices cracking, its gardens withering as the Ethel core went through its transformation. Ilara carried Kaelen. She didn't ask for help, and she didn't look back. She carried him with a strength that defied the laws of her biology, her arms wrapped around his fragile, aged frame as they moved through the crumbling corridors of the medical wing. Naira led the way. She was no longer the small child who needed to be carried. She was a whirlwind of strategic efficiency, using her newly restored energy to hack into the ship's navigation grid, opening emergency blast doors and overriding security lockouts with a speed that made the ship's internal AI seem sluggish. "Check 6, Naira shouted, her voice ringing through the smoke-filled hallway. 2 security drones approaching from the portside ventilation. Kaelen stirred in Ilara's arms. His eyes fluttered open, but they were clouded with a milky film of age. "Is that a tango?" he rasped, his mind drifting back to the Orion Belt. "It's nothing, Kaelen," Ilara said, her voice a soothing murmur against the roar of the alarms. "Just a few scrapper drones trying to play hero. We're almost at the shuttle. Stay with me." "I'm staying," Kaelen muttered, though he could feel his grip on reality slipping. "Just taking a tactical nap." They reached the emergency hangar, a cavernous space filled with the smell of burning propellant and the high-pitched whine of escaping atmosphere. Most of the shuttles were already gone, the launch platforms empty and scarred by the heat of departure. Only one ship remained, a small, sleek courier vessel that looked like it had been designed for speed rather than comfort. It was guarded by a single Praetorian, a young soldier who looked more terrified than lethal. "Stand aside," Alara commanded, her voice echoing through the hangar. The guard raised his staff, but his hands were shaking. "Princess Alara, the Regent has ordered." "The Regent is currently contemplating his own mortality in the lower decks," Alara said, not slowing her pace. "If you want to live to see the next sunrise, you will get out of our way." The guard looked at the princess, then at the silver-haired man in her arms. He had seen the light in the vault. He had heard the whispers of the human who had broken the symmetry. He lowered his staff and stepped back, his head bowed in a gesture that was half fear and half reverence. They boarded the courier, the hatch hissing shut behind them, sealing out the chaos of the Sovereign Nebula. Alara laid Kaelen in the pilot's seat, her hands trembling as she strapped him in. Nira was already at the controls, her fingers dancing across the bioluminescent interface, engaging quantum fold engines. "We need to jump before the nebula's core reaches critical mass." "Where are we going?" Alara asked, her eyes fixed on Kaelen's pale face. "Obsidian Spire," Nira said. "It is the only place they won't look for us, and the only place with enough liquid regret to keep Dad happy when he wakes up." The courier surged forward, the acceleration pinning them into their seats. Kaelen felt the familiar, gut-wrenching tug of the fold drive, a sensation that usually made him vomit. This time, he just felt a profound, bone-deep stillness. He looked out the viewport as they cleared the nebula's hangar. The great ship was a silhouette of fire against the darkness of space, its golden towers snapping like dry twigs. It was the end of an era, the death of 1,000 years of stagnant perfection, and it was beautiful. Kaelen felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned his head and saw Nira. She was looking at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You saved us," she said. "I just balance the books, kid," Kaelen whispered. "You gave me 20 years, Nira said. "I have calculated the interest. According to human standards of gratitude, I owe you approximately 742 years of filial loyalty." Kaelen let out a dry, hacking laugh. 700? That's a lot of school plays. "I intend to be very thorough," Nira said, her lips curving into a smile that was entirely, beautifully human. The fold drive engaged, and the stars turned into streaks of white light. The Sovereign Nebula vanished, leaving behind only the dark void and the three people who had chosen to be a family in the middle of it. Kaelen closed his eyes. He felt the weight of his years, the 80 years he now carried in his 42-year-old soul. He felt the fatigue that would never truly leave him, the way his joints would always ache when the weather changed, the way his heart would always skip a beat when he saw a flash of emerald green. But he also felt the warmth of Alara's hand on his, and the steady, vibrant pulse of Nira's heartbeat in the air between them. He thought about the books he would show her, the Earth stories about oceans and forests, and the people who chose to stay when the world was falling apart. He thought about the 5 minutes he had promised, and the forever he had accidentally bought. "I'm tired," he thought, as the ship settled into the long silence of deep space. "But for the first time in my life, I'm not alone." In the back of the ship, Alara was already working on the courier's engine, her hands covered in grease, her regal silks replaced by a utilitarian jumpsuit she had found in the locker. She was a mechanic again, she was a mother, and she was a woman who had finally found something worth building. Nira sat in the co-pilot's seat, watching the navigation charts. She was thinking about the future, about the science she would change, and the grandchildren she would one day tell about the man who had traded his youth for a girl's first breath of a real life. She looked at Kaelen, who was sleeping now, his breath even and calm. "Sit rep. Home," she whispered to herself. The courier drifted through the stars, a tiny speck of light in a universe that was vast, cold, and utterly indifferent to the laws of symmetry. But inside the ship, there was a heat that the void could never extinguish. There was a family, and there was a choice, and there was a man who had finally understood that the most important things in life aren't found in the numbers. They're found in the 5 minutes when the pretending stops. The return to Obsidian Spire was not a victory parade. There were no fanfare trumpets, no crystalline arches, and certainly no golden light to greet the battered courier ship as it limped into the magnetic docking bay of the moon Gorvex. Instead, there was only the familiar, oppressive scent of industrial sulfur, the rhythmic thud of the atmospheric scrubbers, and the endless, corrosive rain that hammered against the station's hull like 10,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Kaelen Vane sat in the co-pilot's seat, though he was no longer flying. He couldn't. His hands, once steady enough to suture a wound in a moving transport, now shook with a fine, persistent tremor that made even the simplest task an exercise in frustration. His silver hair, once just a touch of salt at the temples, was now a shocking, brilliant white that made him look like a ghost caught in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the cabin. He was 80 years old, not in years but in the marrow of his bones, in the way his heart struggled to push blood through his tired veins, in the way the fatigue episodes hit him, sudden crushing waves of exhaustion that felt like the universe was trying to reclaim the energy he had stolen from it to save a child. "Contact in 3, 2, 1, Nira whispered. The ship groaned as the docking clamps engaged. The magnetic lock was rough, jarring Kaelen's brittle joints and making him hiss through his teeth. "Sit rep," Kaelen wheezed, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a pavement. "Docking successful, Dad," Nira said. She turned from the console, and Kaelen felt a brief, sharp pang of pride that almost outweighed the ache in his chest. She looked magnificent. The loom wilt was gone, her emerald skin glowing with a health so vibrant it seemed to illuminate the cramped cockpit. Her gold eyes were clear, sharp, and focused. She had the essence of the sovereign nebula in her blood, but she had the fire of a human in her spirit. "The station's local mesh is oblivious," Nira continued, her fingers dancing over her data slate. "They still think we are just 3 more scraps of driftwood from the Gorvex mines. The region's hunters haven't reached this sector yet, probably too busy putting out the fires we left in the Essence Vault." "Good," Kaelen muttered. "Let them burn. They've got 10,000 years of debt to pay to the universe." Ilara emerged from the rear of the ship, her hands covered in a mixture of blue coolant and dark grease. She had spent the entire journey in the engine room, coaxing the courier ship to stay in one piece, while the quantum fold drive tried to tear itself apart. Her royal silks were long gone, replaced by a pair of rugged, grease-stained trousers and a simple gray undershirt. She looked less like a princess and more like the mechanic she had been forced to become. And strangely, she looked more at peace than Kaelen had ever seen her. "The engines are slagged," Ilara said, wiping her forehead with the back of a dirty hand. "We won't be jumping again for a long time. But we're down. We're safe." She crossed the cockpit and knelt beside Kaelen's chair. Her eyes, usually so sharp and guarded, were soft as they scanned his face. She took his trembling hand in hers, her warmth a grounding force against the cold of his fatigue. "How are the vitals?" she asked quietly. "Running on emergency reserves," Kaelen said, trying to summon a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But I'm still Oscar Mike, on the move. Mostly." "You're a liar, Kaelen Cole," Ilara whispered, but there was no bite in it. She pressed her forehead against his, a gesture that no longer felt foreign or calculated. It felt like home. The transition from the ship back into the gritty reality of Obsidian Spire was a slow, painful process. Every step Kaelen took across the landing platform felt like a mile. He leaned heavily on Ilara's shoulder, while Nira walked ahead, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows for anything that looked like a Praetorian visor. They didn't go back to the high-end apartments or the hidden safe houses Ilara had used before. They went to the lowest level of the station, to a cluster of hab units that smelled of damp metal and recycled air. It was a place where people came to disappear, where names were optional and pasts were something you kept under your mattress. It was perfect. As they settled into their new cramped reality, the immediate aftermath of the vault began to sink in. For Ilara, it was the realization that the empire she had been raised to serve was not just broken, but morally bankrupt. She spent her nights at the small, flickering terminal, watching the news feeds from the inner sectors. The sovereign nebula was in a state of civil unrest. Valen was still alive, But his authority was crumbling as the lower castes realized the symmetry was nothing more than a cage designed to keep them in the dark. "He's trying to blame the humans," Alara said one evening, her face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. "He's calling it a biological terror attack. He wants to start a war with the Earth territories to distract everyone from the fact that he tried to murder his own niece." Kaelen, sitting in a reclining chair that Nira had modified with extra lumbar support, didn't look up from the old battered book he was reading, a first edition of an ancient text about the sea. "Let him try," Kaelen said. "Earth's got enough problems without worrying about a dying empire. Besides, the truth's got a funny way of leaking out, especially when you've got a genius hacker for a daughter." Naira, who was busy rewiring a portable heater, didn't look up, but her lips curved into a small, satisfied smirk. "I've already seeded the internal archives with the raw data logs from the Essence Vault. In 3 days, every citizen on the nebula will know exactly what the Regent did. The probability of him keeping his throne is currently at 0.04%. "Strategy," Kaelen murmured, nodding. But as the days turned into weeks, the physical cost of the strategy became the central theme of their lives. Kaelen's fatigue episodes were becoming more frequent. Sometimes he would be mid-sentence, and his eyes would simply glaze over, his body slumping as his brain decided it didn't have the energy to maintain consciousness. During these times, Nira would sit beside him, her small hand on his chest, feeling the slow, heavy thud of his heart. She had analyzed the data, of course. She knew that he was dying, not today, and perhaps not even this year, but the biological clock he had wound up in the vault was ticking faster than it should. One afternoon, Kaelen woke from a particularly long episode to find Naira watching him with an intensity that reminded him of their first meeting in the bar. "I have been calculating the variables of the life transfer," Naira said, her voice small and tight. "The exchange was highly asymmetrical. You gave me 22 years of your biological potential, but the metabolic cost of the conversion means you actually lost nearly 40 years of your remaining lifespan." Kaelen reached out and patted her hand. "Numbers, kid. Just numbers." "It is not just numbers," Naira snapped, her gold eyes flashing with a sudden raw emotion. "It is time. It is minutes and hours that you won't have. You could have lived for another half-century. You could have been a young man. You could have—" "I would have been a young man drinking himself to death in a bar on the edge of the galaxy, Nira," Kaelen interrupted, his voice surprisingly firm. "I was 42 years old and I was already dead. I had no one. I had nothing, and I was just waiting for the booze to finish what the war started." He leaned forward, ignoring the ache in his back. "You didn't take my years, sweetheart. You gave me a reason to use them. For the first time in a decade, I'm not just taking up space. I'm a dad. And a dad doesn't count the cost of his child's life. He just pays it and is glad he had the currency." Naira stared at him for a long time, the logic of her brilliant mind crashing against the irrationality of human love. Then slowly she leaned forward and buried her face in his shoulder. She didn't cry. Xylothane tear ducts were inefficient, but she gripped his shirt with a strength that told him she finally understood. Ilara watched them from the doorway, her arms crossed. She had seen the sacrifice, and she had seen the aftermath. She had spent her life believing that power was something you inherited, something that was determined by the purity of your blood and the status of your house. She looked at Kaelen, a human, a deserter, a scrapper who was currently struggling to hold a book. He had no power in the traditional sense. He had no empire. He had no title. And yet he was the most powerful person she had ever known, because he was the only one who had the courage to choose his family when the universe told him he had no right to one. "The atmospheric scrubbers are failing on Sector 7, Ilara said, her voice clear and purposeful as she stepped into the room. "The station manager is looking for a senior mechanic and a technician who doesn't mind getting their hands dirty. The pay is terrible, the hours are worse, and we'll probably be breathing rust for the next 6 months." Kaelen looked at her and grinned, a real, vibrant grin that made him look like the soldier he used to be. "Sounds like a major snafu." "Exactly," Ilara said, her eyes twinkling. "Are you in?" Kaelen looked at Nira, then back at Ilara. He felt the weight of his age, the fragility of his heart, and the uncertainty of their future. But more than that, he felt a sense of belonging so profound it made the stars look dim. "I'm Oscar Mike," Kaelen said, pushing himself out of his chair with a grunt of effort. "Let's go to work." 2 years had passed since the day a human man walked into a bar and agreed to be a father for 5 minutes. On Obsidian Spire, 2 years was an eternity. It was long enough for the rust to claim another layer of the hull, for the neon signs to flicker out and be replaced by dim emergency lights, and for a family of 3 to become a legend in the lower levels. Kaelen Vane sat on a crate in the main hangar of their modest repair shop, Vane and Daughter Biomechanicals. The shop was a converted storage bay filled with the hum of welding torches and the scent of ozone. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't quiet, but it was theirs. Kaelen was 94% gray now. His face was a map of deep lines, and he moved with the slow, deliberate care of a man who knew his skeleton was a delicate architecture. But his eyes, the same blue eyes that had once stared into the void of the Orion Belt, were bright and sharp. He was busy. He was always busy. He was currently hunched over a delicate piece of medical equipment, a portable stabilizer for a miner's lung. It was a tedious, difficult job that required steady hands, something Kaelen technically didn't have. But he had developed a workaround. He used a series of magnetic stabilizers that Nira had built for him, allowing him to work despite his tremors. "Almost there," Kaelen muttered, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth. He clicked a tiny bypass switch into place, and the machine hummed to life with a healthy, rhythmic pulse. "Nice work, Dad," a voice said from above. Kaelen looked up. Nira was hanging upside down from a gantry crane, her emerald skin slightly darker from the grease of a heavy transport engine she was overhauling. She was 11 now, but she had the height of a teenager and the confidence of a master engineer. "You're supposed to be calibrating the thermal injectors, not watching me struggle with a first aid kit," Kaelen said, though his voice was full of warmth. "I finished the injectors 20 minutes ago," Nira said, flipping herself down onto the floor with a graceful agility that Kaelen envied. "I also optimized the fuel flow on that scrapper's hauler. We're currently 40% over our quarterly earnings goal. I'm thinking we should invest in a new plasma cutter. Or maybe some real coffee," Kaelen suggested. "The synthetic stuff is starting to taste like burnt rubber." "I'll add it to the logistical requirements," Nira said, her gold eyes sparkling. Elara walked into the shop carrying a stack of data slates. She was the Vane of the business, the one who handled the contracts, the station authorities, and the occasional imperial bounty hunter who wandered too far from the inner sectors. She had a streak of black grease across her nose and a smile that she only ever showed inside these 4 walls. "The station manager just authorized us to handle the maintenance for the entire East Wing," Elara said, leaning against a workbench. "It seems word has gotten out that we're the only shop on the Spire that doesn't overcharge for oxygen scrubbers." "Being honest is a terrible business model, Elara," Kaelen joked. "Maybe," she said, stepping closer to him and resting a hand on his silver hair. "But it's a great way to live." Kaelen looked around his shop. He looked at the daughter he had bought with his own youth, and the woman who had traded a throne for a life of honest work. He felt the fatigue tugging at the edges of his mind, a constant reminder that his time was a finite currency. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the end. He had done the work. He had finished the job. Later that evening, after the shop lights had been dimmed and Nira had fallen asleep in the small hab unit they shared, Kaelen sat on the balcony overlooking the Moon Gorvex. The rain was still falling, but it didn't seem as corrosive tonight. It looked like diamonds falling against the backdrop of the glowing volcanic craters below. He looked at his hands, old, scarred, and trembling. "For 40 years I moved through the galaxy like a ghost, convinced that my only purpose was to take up as little space as possible. I was a medic who had forgotten how to heal, a soldier who had forgotten what he was fighting for. I thought that family was a luxury for people with pure blood and clean records, something that was given to you at birth and taken away by fate. I was so wrong. I spent my youth trying to survive the wars of other men, only to realize that the most important battle I would ever fight was for 5 minutes of pretending. 5 minutes that turned into a lifetime. I gave away my years, my strength, and my very skin to save a girl who wasn't mine by law, but who became mine by choice. And in that exchange, I found the only thing that actually matters. Humanity isn't about DNA or symmetry or the number of stars you've conquered. It's about the willingness to be a bridge. It's about looking at a broken world and deciding that you are going to be the one who stays, the one who holds the line, the one who chooses to love even when the math says it's a losing game. I'm an old man now, and my heart skips a beat more often than it hits one, but I've never felt more alive. Because I know that when I finally close my eyes, I'm not just disappearing into the void. I'm leaving behind a legacy of choices, and that is a victory no empire can ever take away. Kaelen felt a presence beside him. Ilara was there, silent as a shadow, draped in a warm blanket that she shared with him. They sat together in the quiet of the station, two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their own lives. "Kaelen," she whispered. "Yeah? I'm glad you walked into that bar." Kaelen smiled, leaning his head back against the cold metal of the railing. "Best 5 minutes of my life, Ilara. Best 5 minutes of my life." He looked out at the dark, vast expanse of space, thinking about the millions of people out there, all searching for a reason to matter, all counting their credits and their days as if they were the only things of value. I used to be one of them. I used to think my life was a ledger of debts I could never pay back. I wonder, have you ever found yourself standing at a crossroads where the logical choice was to walk away, but you chose to stay instead? What was the moment you realized that family wasn't something you were born into, but something you had the courage to build from the wreckage? Kaelen reached out and took Alara's hand, his fingers finally finding a moment of stillness in her grip. Beyond the station, a single star flared to life in the distance, a new sun being born in a distant nebula, a small, stubborn light burning in the center of the dark.